Good morning, and welcome to today's event with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. My name is Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian. I cover China for Axios, and I will be guiding our discussion today. Our panel today is called, Can Cooperation on Missile Defense Avoid a U.S.-China Nuclear Arms Race? This event marks the launch of Tong Zhao's new report, Narrowing the U.S.-China Gap on Missile Defense, How to Help Forestall a Nuclear Arms Race. We will discuss growing U.S.-China military competition and whether potentially disastrous global consequences can be averted. I will first introduce our panelists today. Tong Zhao is a senior fellow in Carnegie's Nuclear Policy Program, based at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. He was previously a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow with the Managing the Atom Project and the International Security Program at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. He is joining us from Beijing. Oriana Mastro is Assistant Professor at Georgetown University and resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on Chinese military and security policy in the Asia-Pacific and rising power challenges to the international order. She concurrently serves in the United States Air Force Reserve as a senior China analyst at the Pentagon. Susan Thornton is senior fellow and research scholar at the Paul Tsai China Center at Yale University Law School, and former acting assistant secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the Department of State. The panelists will now offer their opening remarks, after which we will have a Q&A. So I would like to begin now with Tong Zhao.
Well, thank you so much, Bethany. I really appreciate it. From my personal view, I think the risk of arms race between US and China is real. If people recall, just recently, Hu Xijin, the chief editor of Global Times, proposed that China should build at least 1,000 nuclear weapons in the near-term future. And his argument received wide public support. But it's the view of the Chinese expert community that counts, because they have real influence on policy making. But the fact is, even among the Chinese nuclear policy experts, they generally agree that China needs to continue modernizing and even building up its nuclear forces, because they think China's nuclear deterrence is facing increasing external threats. And that's a genuine concern. And one of the most important external threats that Chinese nuclear policy experts believe is coming from American missile defense. There is clearly a huge perception gap between US and China. From the Chinese perspective, China is simply responding to the potential threat from American missile defense in terms of China's nuclear modernization. But from the American perspective, China is obviously arms racing, trying to achieve nuclear parity with the other big nuclear powers. The fact is, the United States does not have the coercive power to force China into an arms control deal. The US simply does not have that leverage. So the two countries have to come back to address the underlying drivers behind China's nuclear modernization efforts. So they have to do this in order to achieve a stable nuclear relationship and to manage their increasingly dangerous military competition and to promote arms control cooperation. The good news is over the issue of American missile defense, the two countries do not have a real conflict of interests. The US is not aiming its missile defense to undermining China's nuclear deterrent. And China's nuclear modernization is primarily aimed at preserving a credible deterrent. But the problem is there are significant ambiguities in the specific capabilities and policies in both countries over the issue of missile defense and nuclear. Most ambiguities are unintentional, but they do cause serious misperceptions, and over time they cause distrust. And the existing bilateral dialogues, exchanges between the two countries so far have been too superficial and generic to really examine and address the sources of these ambiguities and the resulting perception gap. So this research basically identifies three main sets of ambiguities. The first is China's concerns toward American missile defense are ambiguous. Even though China has made various statements about why US missile defense threatens China, but indeed, there appears no real internal consensus in China on what Chinese interests are threatened by which aspects or elements of American missile defense and how and why. And additionally, although missile defense is the greatest external driver of China's nuclear modernization, it's unclear how important it is if compared with various internal factors that also potentially contribute to China's nuclear modernization. And these can cause confusion to the United States and other countries. And second, it is good that the US has a policy of not aiming to undermine China's nuclear deterrence with missile defense. But the US has not done all it can to embed this policy in specific capabilities and postures at the operational level. There are 5 specific American ambiguities that can make China suspicious. For example, there is the issue of whether homeland missile defense against DPRK can target Chinese ICBMs, and whether the line between regional missile defense and homeland missile defense is becoming increasingly ambiguous. This is a major Chinese concern in the case of the deployment of the THAAD missile defense system in South Korea about 4 years ago, and the DoD proposal to develop the layered homeland missile defense is making this ambiguity even worse. The third point is China is also responding to the perceived missile defense threat in a way that may create further uncertainty about Chinese intentions. Chinese experts, for example, have discussed counterforce strategy such as system penetration or system confrontation. But these may appear aiming not just at countering American missile defense, but seeking advantage in comprehensive military competition. So this could also cause confusion about Chinese intention. So given these challenges, this report offers a set of unilateral and cooperative measures that can be taken. And I will give some very brief examples quickly. The United States, for example, can show willingness to respond to Chinese concerns by studying the technical and operational feasibility of drawing clearer distinctions between strategic and theater missile defense systems, and between capabilities aimed at North Korea and those affecting China. And China should apply a clear and consistent methodology to its internal evaluations of what constitutes sufficient nuclear retaliation and countervailing capabilities against missile defense. And this can help prevent domestic advocacy groups from justifying their own development interests in terms of national security. And both countries can conduct a joint study on the technical feasibility for the US to design a homeland missile defense system that can only intercept North Korean ICBMs without seriously affecting Chinese ones. Looking into the future, a more ambitious step toward arms control is for the two countries jointly explore options to incorporate missile defense into an overall arms control framework without undermining American capacity to develop its missile defense capability against so-called rogue countries. There's no obvious reason why this cannot be done. We just need joint and substantive effort to figure out the details. And I believe it is a time we start. It's time that we start serious discussions on these issues to help prevent an all-out U.S.-China arms race and a military rivalry that would have global implications. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those opening remarks. I would like to move on now to our next panelist, Oriana Mastro.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure to read this report, and I really commend Tong Zhao for taking on such a difficult topic in terms of arms control between China and the United States. My comments are mainly going to revolve around the report. I would like to hear more about certain aspects that he has laid out, so I won't take the time to summarize it since he did that so succinctly, but sort of delve into some of the curiosities that I had when I was reading through it. The first thing is that he very specifically, and I think correctly, laid out these ambiguities that exist. For example, China is concerned about missile defense, but is somewhat unclear about what aspects they're most concerned about. And it's also unclear whether China's concerns are about the technical aspects of the missile defense or the geostrategic implications of the United States having that missile defense. I think that's a very important point, because I think there's a lot of aspects of the U.S.-China relationship that fall under this rubric of it's not the exact action that's of concern, but what the action signals to the other side. And so I'd be curious if, I think you're right, if it really is the technical aspects, then things like discussions, might help with that. But if it is about basically geopolitical intent, and China's not so concerned about missile defense effectiveness, but more about the intent that signals on the United States, then what is the best way forward? And I ask this because I think that actually is probably a more likely scenario, only because I have been a part of so many dialogues, and I'm sure you have too, in which the United States explains the technical aspects of like THAAD, for example, and how it doesn't threaten China, but the Chinese participants are still not reassured. So I always wondered, and I think you really articulate this well. Is it that they don't understand those technical aspects? Is it that they don't believe them? Or is it this geopolitical issue, which I think is harder to deal with in terms of arms control? And in terms of your recommendation, just because I'm on this topic of the technical aspects of, the United States could signal that this is a system for rogue regimes and not a system for China. I'm not a engineer, but it's my understanding that obviously, and I think if you had more time, you'd go into this in more detail, but any system that can intercept a North Korean ICBM can also intercept the Chinese ICBM. I think the thing that could be done has to do with saturation rates, that the United States could have a system that could only defend against a limited number of missiles. Like that's something I think technically is possible, that you could say, okay, we can defend against 10 missiles, and after that the system is saturated and they won't be defended. And this would, you couldn't say to China, we're not going to get any of your missiles, but that would be a way to say to China, because China has hundreds, that their nuclear deterrent wouldn't be undermined. So I'm not sure in terms of the technical aspects if that was something that you were thinking about. So the confidence building measures, I think, are important. And one of the suggestions you make, which I really like, is that a U.S. no first use policy would help. And I teach a course in the Chinese military. I do a whole week on, obviously, Chinese nuclear doctrine. And I always lay out how very reasonable, actually in comparison to the United States, China's nuclear doctrine is. I always ask my students, what is the U.S. nuclear doctrine? And they're like, no first use? I'm like, no, that is not. The United States reserves the right to use nuclear weapons, basically against whoever we want, in whatever situation we want, right? But nuclear experts. So as a China expert, I believe the Chinese no first use policy, because I think it comes from, a long history and visions of nuclear weapons, mainly for defense against nuclear weapons because of China's experiences with nuclear blackmail. I look at how the Strategic Rocket Force trains And it looks to me like they actually are training to absorb a nuclear attack first before they respond. So I find that very credible. But most nuke experts in the United States don't find any of these promises from China credible. So I'm kind of curious, on the Chinese side, if the United States did have that no first use doctrine, do you think people in China would do something in terms of reassurance, that they would actually believe us? In terms of you have a whole section which I thought was very interesting on China's vulnerabilities of second strike. And it was my understanding, actually, before this missile defense issue, that China seemed to suggest a relative comfort with the vulnerability of their nuclear force because they did not have a second strike capability, and they did not have that basically by choice, because they took a long time. It was not a priority to move from liquid to solid fuels, from silos to mobile systems. And so I'm curious, do you think that because there was that a level of higher comfort before with that vulnerability, than you suggest that they have now, is my interpretation of why nuclear modernization was delayed incorrect? And you think China was always really uncomfortable with this, or do you think something has changed within China that has made the Chinese more sensitive? Because from just a sort of a theoretical point of view, I wonder, why are you so sensitive about missile defense when, for decades, you had all your systems at the lowest level of readiness in silos where the United States knew where they were. For decades, the United States could have taken out the whole, Chinese nuclear arsenal. And China had their own, they had the ability to do something about it, but didn't for a very long time. So kind of curious of your interpretation of that sort of second strike capability, why they didn't have it until relatively recently. And along those lines, with the vulnerabilities, has China's views of the number of warheads that they need to be able to retaliate if they are hit first changed? Specifically, what I'm asking is, whether a deterrent works depends on what is an unacceptable cost to the other side. So China only needs a certain number, the number of nuclear weapons that the United States would find unacceptable to absorb. Now, I think historically, when I read Chinese strategic thinking on this, the view was that number was actually relatively low. You could deter the United States with just, 2 or 3 if they make it through. And that's why China felt comfortable with this minimum assured deterrent. I'm wondering if one of the underlying structures that has changed as this missile defense issue has come up has been the number of systems that they think need to get through. So, we talked about the strategic mindset, which I thought was very, very interesting. And this is sort of a little bit off topic, but I did a study a while ago about China's critiques in terms of arms racing, and found that actually most of the blame, and this unfortunately went up to 2018, looking at Chinese media, leadership speeches, most of the blame for who is driving arms racing wasn't the United States, but Japan. Now, they weren't too far off. I'm not saying that, China was not worried about the United States at all, and only worried about Japan. But I wonder how Japan fits into this whole picture for you. And, if Japan needs to be in any way a part of the discussions for arms control or not. And since I brought up another, one third party, you mentioned another in your report, which really sparked my interest, which is Russia. You mentioned that you thought that China was pursuing deeper defense cooperation with Russia because of U.S., the missile defense. And so I really would like to hear more on that, because this is a key topic right now in the United States about how does U.S. policy impact the relationship between China and Russia, and if so, how it does so. The final thing I'll just say is, a lot of people are very skeptical about arms control between China and the United States, mainly because China has demonstrated very little interest in doing so. The United States has been relatively interested. So do you think there's a change happening? One thing that I've heard from the Chinese military is that arms control about emerging technologies are easier because you haven't implemented them yet. Arms control about established systems, which is what you're dealing with, like conventional precision-guided munitions and nuclear weapons, are harder to deal with. So is there something about the U.S.-China relationship today, the tensions increasing, higher probability of conflict, I don't know, that you think now is the opportune time to try to pursue this? So I'm not sure how much extra context I provided. I just found the report very fascinating and had a lot of questions of my own. And I hope that at the very least sparks some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for those very insightful remarks, Oriana. I will return to some of your questions when we enter the Q&A and give Tong Zhao and others a chance to respond. Now I would like to turn to Susan for your remarks.
Great. Thank you so much, Bethany and Oriana, Tong Zhao. Good to see you both here today. I definitely want to commend you, Tong Zhao, on coming up with this report on this very hot topic. I think, U.S.-China suspicions and misperceptions in arms buildup and arms control, in this case surrounding U.S. missile defense, but in many other areas, is certainly at the forefront of discussions right now. And hang on just one second. I'm trying to zoom 2 places at once. It doesn't work out very well. But I am not a military expert, obviously, and I'm fascinated to hear Oriana's comments on the report. I have, though, followed the vagaries of discussions between the U.S. and China about arms control related issues, missile defense issues, from the perch of a person who is trying to manage the U.S.-China relationship over the years. So it's interesting to me to see how the conversation about arms control is changing and also how it's not changing. But your scholarship in exploring both the American and Chinese sides of this issue, I think, trying to elucidate the misperceptions on both sides is very important, especially at this moment. I do think it's important to recognize, and from the conversations I've been in, I have to tell you, all of the U.S. arms controllers that I've dealt with have cut their teeth on arms control in dealing with the Soviet Union. And this lends, I would say, a certain mindset and culture to the discussions that China really hasn't been as much a party to. I mean, certainly in some multilateral fora, China has been involved, but in general, in the sort of bilateral arms control world between the US and the Soviet Union, China was not part of those conversations. And so there are a lot of, maybe because of that, there are more possibilities for misunderstanding, over-interpreting, et cetera, than there would otherwise be in other topics of disagreement between the US and China. Certainly over the years, the on-off nature of the U.S.-China mill-mill relationship has hampered, I think, getting to deeper discussions on some of these issues. Oriana may disagree with me, but the conversations I've seen, have been very superficial. And then when the relationship was sort of in the freezer for a while, we would have to start again at square one. So that was not conducive to bettering understanding on these issues. I think it has improved a bit in recent years, but I think probably now has fallen back again in this current climate of antagonism and pretty extreme mistrust. It takes incredible political will, I think, on the part of a US government or on the part of a Chinese government to get serious conversations going between the two of us on these issues, given the antagonism between our two militaries. And even when U.S.-China relations, everyone talks now about U.S.-China relations having had these halcyon periods, which I never experienced, frankly, but this is the narrative that comes up now in the media, that this U.S.-China engagement was some kind of love fest. There was never a time when the U.S. military and the Chinese military, I would say, could be described in those kinds of terms. This was always a very difficult and prickly relationship. So given that, I mean, this is a very tough area. And not only that, but you've taken on a topic where, there's a lot of information probably on these topics that we can't get access to because it's classified and very sensitive. So you're trying to write about a topic where you must realize that there's probably a lot that you aren't seeing about what's going on both sides. Let me just, for the benefit of the audience and also some background on these issues, talk about what I've heard the Chinese tell us over the years are their reasons for, frankly, not being as interested as the US was in talking about these issues in depth. And then maybe we can go from there as to sort of what the potential is for some of these CBMs that you've outlined to evolve into something productive, and maybe what's changed about the current situation that makes it different from the past, that makes it more likely that we can get some progress in this area. First, I mean, the one obvious point, and you make it in your paper, is that China believes that mutual transparency is to the advantage of the stronger power, and therefore China is not so interested in transparency. I mean, the kinds of on-site inspections that we have had with the Soviet Union and that we now have with Russia have not actually been of much interest to the Chinese side, because China was always using ambiguity to its favor, and hoped that, a bit of uncertainty surrounding what it was doing could help bolster its more meager arsenal, and give it some more leverage in the relationship with the United States. So I think the lack of interest on the Chinese part in pursuing, mutual transparency initiatives has been something that's come up over and over and over and over again in the conversations. Second thing that has always occurred to me, and I would be very interested in a further discussion of, is, the incentives for China to engage in arms control. Arms control has not been a priority for the Chinese diplomatic service, for sure. I can say that. I don't think it's been a priority for the Chinese military. China has not been in the past worried about controlling its military spending. And I think, to be honest, it probably hasn't minded that the US continued spending in this area, because China believes that at the end of the day, it's, competition with the US is primarily an economic competition. And so they believe that if the Americans are going to be spending in this area, that is a problem they're creating for themselves, and why should China, save them from doing that? So the bilateral dynamic that existed in the US-Soviet competition, where both sides wanted to reduce military spending and limit the arms race, may not exist in the US-China context, and I would be very interested to hear your thoughts on what are the incentives for, and Oriana's thoughts on what are the incentives for China to engage in arms control. I think that this picture is probably changing now, and also the dynamics in the international environment, in the bilateral environment, are changing, which may change this picture. But that has been definitely an issue in previous discussions about arms control. I think another thing that may be more specific to missile defense, and the types of things that Oriana was talking about, is that China's experiences with the US in discussing issues specific to US intentions with its missile defense have not always built trust. And I think, in particular, some discussions of the deployment of missile defense to defend against North Korean missiles, nuclear missiles, ICBMs, etc., were not completely consistent and may have elevated suspicions on the Chinese part. I think In some cases, the U.S. briefings on missile defense have left out significant parts of, or basically given short shrift to Chinese questions that haven't been answered. And, that may not be because they're hiding something. It may just be because these conversations are not very long and detailed, and there's a lot of complicated orchestration in getting the conversations to happen. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and miscommunication surrounding the efforts that were made actually to answer some of Chinese questions about these missile defense deployments. And I think, unfortunately, a chance that maybe existed to try to allay some of China's suspicions did not turn out to work in our favor in the way that we had hoped. So those are just some brief observations that I have from my experience. I think the U.S., and I'm very interested in Oriana's question about the difference between sort of the technical capabilities and the signaling about strategic intent. And I very much believe that China is less interested in explanations about technical capabilities and puts a lot more emphasis on the issues of strategic trust, strategic intent, and what the U.S. is signaling. And there's also a lot of internal bureaucratic dynamics around these questions inside China. So it's very hard for people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example, to answer the questions of people in the PLA sufficiently and gain the kind of leverage they would need to pursue these discussions in a way that might alleviate some of the suspicions. So I think there are a lot of problems that I see in going forward on this. And, I'm hopeful, though, that because the U.S.-China relationship has, turned in such a negative direction, and maybe because the international environment surrounding these sort of military systems is changing, China is changing, that in the future we could get to a more productive discussion of this. And the last thing I'll say is that, for the moment, people are calling the U.S.-China military relationship the bright spot in the relationship. And so, maybe this is the area actually that has some potential for getting some traction, probably not during a presidential election campaign, but maybe shortly after that would be finished. So I think we should definitely take your report and brief it to people who are trying to think of things that can be done in the relationship to get us on a more productive track, and see if this is something that we could start on. So I'll just leave it there, and also again want to commend you for your efforts here.
Thank you, Susan. Your years of experience, dealing directly in the space of U.S.-China relations really comes out in those remarks. I would like to direct Oriana's question to you, Tong Zhao, about the difference in perceptions on the technical aspect. And Oriana, if I could perhaps have you rephrase that question for the audience about that. The difference in perceptions there that you mentioned.
So are you referring to my comment about is the sort of ambiguity really about the technical aspects of the system, or is it yes. What it signals about U.S. strategic intent?
Yes.
Right. So what this means is, and there's many issues like this. If it's not really about the technical aspects, and it's more about what does the fact that the United States is doing this mean for its intentions towards China? I think the latter is probably more likely, and it's also harder to deal with.
Thank you. I will briefly, firstly, thank you all so much for the very insightful and helpful feedback and comments. To answer your question, Bethany and Oriana, I identified the ambiguity between technical concerns and strategic or geopolitical concerns as one major ambiguity in the Chinese policy. And I think the technical issue is still very important because the reason why in many cases China tend to focus more on the geopolitical implications of a missile defense system is because China has already very much believed in the technical threat of this specific system. I will give a brief example of the THAAD issue in 2016. The reason why China, raised this issue to the strategic level was because I think that China firmly reached a consensus internally already that the THAAD poses a serious threat to China's strategic nuclear deterrent capability because of the radar system. And so because it poses a strategic threat, that's why China is making it a big issue. Otherwise, if the US deploys another Patriot system into South Korea, I don't think China would raise the same level of opposition. So it's, if you look at the strategic concern, at the bottom of it is still China's technical threat, China's threat perception about the technical capability. And the reason why China has rejected repeatedly American offer to discuss the technical disagreements, again, is because China has already convinced itself that the technical threat is very clear. China's technical experts very much agreed that it poses a real threat, a serious threat. So the politicians then had little interest to listen to any excuse from the United States. So the bottom line is, at the underlying issue is still genuine disagreement about the technical capabilities of specific missile defense systems, and we cannot ignore those. In fact, I think the key to resolving the strategic disagreements is to narrow down their genuine technical disagreements, and on that basis, they can hopefully have a more effective discussion on strategic implications.
Thank you, Tong Zhao. I would like to encourage our viewers to use the Twitter hashtag #AskCarnegie. If you have questions for any of the panelists, you can also use the YouTube chat to ask those questions. And in a few minutes, we will be switching to an audience Q&A. So do send in those questions while we continue our discussion right here. Susan, I would like to turn to you again. You have so much experience understanding the U.S.-China bilateral relationship. Can you go a little bit deeper into the context of what we have seen over the past 3 years in the deterioration of the U.S.-China bilateral relationship, the sidelining of diplomacy, and the implications of that for preventing an arms race, and the implications of that for potential increase in mutual distrust?
Sure. Well, on this issue in particular, and I talked a little bit about the difficulties of the mill-mill relationship, going all the way back actually to the beginning of the opening with China, but certainly becoming much more intense in the 90s, following Tiananmen Square. And then, going forward through the Belgrade bombing, the EP3 incident. I mean, there are a lot of things that we've all been through, and the vagaries in the relationship in the military sphere have reflected that. And I think, frankly, that the diplomatic conversations about arms control were also a casualty of some of that. we've managed to, set some priorities in areas that get close to this, like on non-proliferation. We made a lot of progress, and other areas touching on closer to the mill-mill relationship, but we were really never able to get very good conversations going in a whole range of arms control related areas. And I'm thinking here not just about talks on strategic stability, which we very much wanted to try to get going at various points in the relationship, but also discussions, for example, on space weapons, on cyber weapons. And while the Chinese side was always willing to sort of engage superficially to start these conversations, they never really got far enough that we didn't have to start over again the next time we had a conversation. So this has been, I think, an area of frustration. I mean, it's understandable to some extent because, like I said in my remarks, China wasn't really incentivized very much to prioritize this as an issue. And it took a lot of political will on the part of the Chinese government to get a real conversation on this going, given the bureaucratic interests in China. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is not a strong actor in this space. So I think it's fairly natural that it would not have been a major focus. But I think now, and not because of the deterioration in U.S.-China relations, but basically because of the changes that are happening in the international system, in the power balance, in China's military modernization, and in the U.S. position as a security provider for the rest of the world, and questions about the U.S. role in the world, et cetera, that have been brought up by the Trump administration. It is, a propitious time to look at, something that could be done in this area. And I think the Chinese side has been, as people have been talking more about this, quite resistant at first. But more recently, in conversations with Chinese colleagues, I have detected a greater willingness to at least countenance the notion of some kind of discussions on some of these issues. And, I think it's not going to be easy. A quote that I heard recently was that, China will never engage in discussions on strategic nuclear reductions in the way that the U.S. has put forward that it should do in the context of U.S.-Russia New START negotiations. But I have heard people also say that they would like to have, and Oriana mentioned this, and we should get maybe into a further discussion of this, but that China would very much like to have a discussion of its no first use doctrine with the United States, and of the U.S. attitude toward no first use and potential, issues there. So I think starting the conversation actually for me as a diplomat is more important, given that our conversations about this have been, pretty unsatisfactory to date. Seeing what the Chinese government now would be willing to talk about. There was some discussion in the Obama administration actually about getting a strategic stability dialogue going, and we did seem to be moving in that direction, and then the administration ended and it didn't happen. So, we would have to start over again, clearly, in an environment of even greater mistrust, I think, at the moment. But I'm hopeful that this is an area. I think China is also leery about arms control because of the context of the U.S.-Soviet Cold War in which it was developed, and they do not want to be seen as following in the footsteps of a Cold War-like framework, which has come up in a number of conversations with Chinese colleagues. So, we would need to think be more creative and subtle and nuanced, I think, about how we approach this. But if we were willing to do that and not just make this some kind of a political point scoring kind of session, if the Chinese saw that the U.S. was sincere and wanted to make real progress, I think they would be willing to take this up with us.
Thank you, Susan. I would like to pose a question for both Oriana and Tong Zhao. What are some of the purely domestic factors on either side, both on the US side and on the Chinese side, that serve right now as barriers to implementing some of the concrete steps that Tong Zhao laid out in his report that the US and China could both take to reduce the perception gap? What are some of the domestic factors on each side that are getting in the way of that, or could get in the way of that? And Oriana, I will start with you, if that's okay.
So I think, because you're asking both of us, you're hoping that I comment on the United States.
Either way.
I'm not a U.S. expert. I'm a China expert, but I'll try to provide some thoughts on this. And if this is from a military perspective, obviously I'm here speaking in my civilian capacity, and my views are only my own and don't represent those of the United States government, Department of Defense, or the Department of the Air Force. But from a military perspective, I think the main issue is the following. The United States and China are actively preparing to fight wars against each other. Right? The PLA, their number one adversary that they prepare for conflicts against is the United States. Now, the United States, we have many different contingencies we're worried about. We're also thinking about North Korea. We're also thinking about the Middle East. So obviously, like a Taiwan contingency is one of many things we're preparing for. But the reality is both sides are preparing. And in a lot of cases, the certain systems that each side has, especially on the conventional side, which a lot of these things are dual use. So that's kind of the problem. But on the conventional side, China has the most advanced ballistic and cruise missile program in the world. And it really is this missile program, of which I think it's something like 80% of those missiles would be prohibited by the INF. So the United States doesn't have those types of systems. And even if we could build them, we don't have a homeland to, base them in range of China. So we don't have those kinds of advantages. So when you talk about arms control, the big distrust, or I think the background thought is like, of course you want me to get rid of these systems so you can have an advantage, if push comes to shove. So I think it's a bit different, and I'm not a Soviet expert, but I think it's a bit different from that relationship, because in the Soviet and US mindset, the nuclear and the conventional were so separated from each other, and we worked very hard through arms control arrangements to make sure there wasn't destabilizing factors in which they overlapped. But we don't have that separation in the China-US relationship. And so I think Tong Zhao mentioned in his report, for example, there's concerns that maybe there's US systems that want to counter China's conventional missiles. And I can't speak to the technical aspects of specific US systems, but I can say the United States would absolutely like to have systems to protect our bases from Chinese missiles. And so because you have that overlap, it makes it very difficult. Both sides are trying to get an operational advantage over each other. And so arms control seems to be like a suggestion to try to get the upper hand in this broader sort of military competition.
Thanks for that. And Tong Zhao, over to you.
Thank you. I was fully aware of the geopolitical challenges when doing the research and writing the report. So the recommendations I came up with, I think already avoided all the major obstacles, both domestic and international. The biggest challenge, I think, in case of China is there is no top-level support for people at the operational level to discuss arms control or to discuss any types of military cooperation with the United States, including on the issue of missile defense. The experts community who are basically scattered across the system in various agencies, institutes, they do not have a strong voice. So the key is to have some top-level blessing to start a domestic discussion and debate on these things among the within the expert community. So I think it's important that the national leaders, they engage with each other first. I like the idea of a P5 arms control summit. So if a Chinese President Xi Jinping would make a symbolic embracement of cooperative security or arms control as a concept, I think that would really help kickstart domestic discussions within the expert community, who I think are more than capable of engaging substantively on these issues and coming up with concrete proposals. And in the case of US, I think US also needs to incentivize, provide positive incentives for China to engage in this discussion. The thing is, the US is not putting anything on the table. It only put pressure on China to join arms control without saying what the US is willing to discuss, including things that might worry China. So if US is willing to put the issue of missile defense, which is the key external driver of Chinese nuclear modernization, I think that would be a great inducement for China to consider arms control. Today, the stronger American pressure is, the greater the conviction in China that arms control is a trap set by the United States. So if you support arms control, you are a traitor, you are pro-America. So the US can help change that narrative and dynamic by putting real incentives, by including things on the table that worry China. And missile defense is something that we certainly should start with.
I'm going to transition now to the audience Q&A. There's a couple of questions that both deal with the Korean Peninsula, so I'll put them together. The first one is from Liz Kim at Voice of America. Does the intensity of U.S.-China nuclear arms race affect North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons? What kinds of implications does the competition between the U.S. and China have on North Korea's strategic stance? So that's the first part of it. The second question, also about the Korean Peninsula, Songmin Lee asks, the U.S. is strengthening regional missile defense around the Korean Peninsula, such as updating THAAD in South Korea, but China's been objecting to this move. How do you see the tension between U.S. and China on missile defense in South Korea? And Tong Zhao, I'll start with you.
Thank you. I think the U.S.-China arms race firstly provides a political opportunity for North Korea to exploit. It counts on the daylight between Washington and Beijing to conduct military provocations without receiving collective punishment from the major powers from the UN Security Council. And also, North Korea's nuclear program already exacerbates the security dilemma between Beijing and Washington. The THAAD is a good example. The THAAD is there in South Korea to defend South Korea from North Korean missile threats, but that somehow creates serious concern from China, and China is reacting very strongly, and that really undermined China-US strategic stability, as well as the overall relationship between Seoul and Beijing. And vice versa, given the intensifying US-China competition, the US is trying to introduce medium-range land-based missiles to this region. Those missiles, I think, are primarily aimed at countering Chinese growing military capability, but they could be viewed by North Korea as a very threatening development because of North Korea's even smaller nuclear arsenal. Even a modest American or South Korean or Japanese medium-range missile stockpile could pose a real threat to North Korea's small nuclear deterrent. So it can exacerbate the security dilemma in both ways. In terms of the second question, tensions in South Korea, it's a general question. I don't have time to go into the details, but I would say that this report, missile defense issue not only between U.S. and China, it affects all the U.S. major allies in this region because they all probably want to deploy greater missile defense capabilities to counter North Korea and to some extent China in some cases as well. So missile defense is an issue between China and all these regional players as well. So it has really much broader regional implications.
Thank you. We have just about 5 minutes left. Would Susan or Oriana like to jump in on that question, or should I move on to the next one?
I could just make a very quick point, which is I think this highlights the difficulties of having different audiences, because THAAD is really about reassuring South Korea. But that was the whole point, is that the South Koreans were under threat from the North Koreans, and so the United States wanted to reassure the South Koreans that their defense, was intact. And so it's always very complicated when you're thinking, okay, I want to reassure this country about what other countries will see it as. And of course, North Korea is going to see this as a threat, because unlike U.S. policy towards China, the United States absolutely wants to be able to get rid of all North Korean nuclear weapons at a time of conflict without any risk of nuclear use on the peninsula. So this is definitely, I think, a part of the U.S. mentality, because North Korea has so few nuclear weapons, because there are plans that include, invasion of North Korea under certain scenarios. This is something that is probably, a goal for the United States military. This does not apply, obviously, to China, because the United States has no desire, no hope to be able to get rid of all of China's nuclear weapons, and has no plans on occupying China anytime soon. So I think it makes sense that North Korea feels threatened, because the United States is, actively threatening them in that way.
Okay, I think this will be our last question. It's a good one. This comes from Rakesh Sood, who says, as long as the US is not ready to accept mutual vulnerability with regard to China, how can the US provide assurance that it will not weaken China's assured retaliation capability? Who would like to go with that one? Tong Zhao, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I can go first. Right now the U.S. Doesn't explicitly adopt mutual vulnerability relationship with China, but it has all the substance in it, in the existing American policy. The U.S., in the case of missile defense policy, doesn't seek to neutralize China's nuclear deterrence by using missile defense. So the thing is, China probably wants some more explicit reassurance from U.S. on this issue. And I think the U.S. shouldn't be afraid to discuss these issues, include the mutual vulnerability and no first use. These are all closely related. I think the U.S. can have this discussion, because the main obstacle for the U.S. to adopt mutual vulnerability and no first use with China is concerns from American allies, Japan, for example. So it's an opportunity to welcome China to also discuss how all these players can together address the obstacles, which means addressing the security concerns of American allies. So it's an opportunity for China to reflect on its own regional military posture. Again, I think it highlights the necessity to broaden the discussion to include additional regional players, Japan, South Korea, and it's also an opportunity for China to think about how its regional military postures can be restructured to address the concerns of Japan, South Korea, so that U.S. would be in a better position to adopt mutual vulnerability and no first use with China.
Okay, we have 1 minute left, so maybe 30 seconds for Susan and Oriana, if you have answers to that or final comments.
Oriana, you go ahead.
I agree with everything Tong Zhao said.
Yeah, me too.
Exists. The United States feels it. There's no one, in the United States that feels like China does not have a nuclear deterrent against us. For U.S. policymakers, the idea of one nuclear weapon making its way to the United States is too much. And I think our policies towards North Korea suggest that. So that mutual vulnerability is there. even if we don't want to publicly state it. And that's why, I think the deterrent is strong. And we should try to move on towards some of the things that Tong Zhao suggested to ensure that both sides aren't wasting time and money on building more nuclear weapons that neither of us needs.
I agree 100% with that statement.
Okay, well, that concludes our panel for today. I would like to thank our panelists and also audience members for joining us today and participating in this discussion. I hope everyone has a good rest of their day or night in Tong Zhao's case.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.